The text message arrived at 2:17 in the morning, glowing harsh and cold on my phone screen as I reached for water on my nightstand. Mom, you're not family anymore. We've decided to move forward without your negativity in our lives. Don't contact us again. My son's words. Jason's words. Sent with the casual cruelty of someone blocking a spam caller, not severing ties with the woman who had given him life. I sat up in bed, reading the message 3 times, 4 times, searching for context I knew wouldn't appear. No argument had preceded this. No confrontation. Just silence for the past 2 weeks since I'd asked a simple question about the family bakery, the business my grandmother had founded in 1952, the one my parents had built into a Seattle institution, the one I'd handed over to Jason 5 years ago when I'd retired. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chen, though everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 62 years old, a widow of 8 years, and until that text message turned my world sideways, I thought I understood my life's narrative. Immigrant parents who'd worked themselves to exhaustion, a daughter who'd honored their sacrifice by expanding the family business, a son who'd seemed ready to carry the legacy forward. A simple story, clean lines, predictable ending. I should have known better. Life rarely offers simple stories. The question I'd asked Jason 2 weeks earlier had been innocent enough, or so I'd thought. I'd stopped by Chen's bakery on a Tuesday afternoon, the way I did every few weeks, not to interfere but to feel connected to the place that still smelled like my childhood, like my mother's hands covered in flour, like my father's patience as he'd taught me to fold dough for char siu bao. Jason had been in the back office, and I'd knocked softly before entering. He'd looked up from his computer with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between guilt and irritation. Just checking in, I'd said, keeping my tone light. How are the numbers looking this quarter? Fine, he'd replied shortly. Everything's fine, but something in his voice had felt off, a tightness that reminded me of when he was 16 and had wrecked my car, then tried to hide it. I'd glanced at his computer screen, not snooping, just a natural shift of my gaze, and I'd seen spreadsheets, numbers in red, unfamiliar company names. What's Cascade Holdings? I'd asked. Nothing, he'd said too quickly, closing the laptop, just exploring some investment opportunities. Investment opportunities. The bakery was the investment, the legacy, the point of everything, with the business. Mom, he'd said with that edge of exasperation adult children reserve for parents they consider meddling, I'm 40 years old. I know how to run a business. You need to trust me. I do trust you, I'd said, hurt creeping into my voice, despite my best efforts. I just want to understand. There's nothing to understand, everything's under control. I'd left that day with unease sitting heavy in my stomach, but I'd told myself I was being paranoid, overprotective, unable to fully let go. Jason was right. He was 40 years old, a grown man with a business degree from the University of Washington, a wife, 2 children. He didn't need his mother questioning every decision, so I'd stayed away for 2 weeks, giving him space, respecting his autonomy, and then came the text. You're not family anymore. I didn't sleep after that message. I lay in the darkness of my bedroom, the one I'd shared with my husband David until cancer had taken him 8 years ago, and I tried to understand what I'd done to deserve such a complete rejection. Had I been too controlling, too present in Jason's life? Had my weekly visits to the bakery felt like surveillance rather than love? By dawn, I'd convinced myself there had to be a misunderstanding, some context I was missing. Jason was my only child. We'd always been close, especially after David died. He'd held my hand at the funeral. He'd called me every Sunday. He'd named his daughter after my mother. People didn't just cut off their parents for asking one question about a business that had been in the family for 70 years. I texted him back at 6 in the morning. Jason, I don't understand. What's happened? Please call me so we can talk. The message showed as read within minutes. No response came. I tried calling. Voicemail. I called my daughter-in-law, Michelle, straight to voicemail, which told me she'd blocked my number. Panic crept in then, the kind that makes your hands shake and your breath come shallow. I'd lost my husband to disease. I couldn't lose my son to silence. I got dressed, Drove across Seattle to the Ballard neighborhood, where Jason and Michelle lived in a renovated Craftsman they'd purchased 3 years ago. I'd helped with the down payment, a gift I'd been happy to give, wanting to see them settled, wanting my grandchildren to have a yard. Jason's car was in the driveway. I parked on the street and walked to the front door, rehearsing what I'd say, something calm and maternal. Something that would bridge whatever gap had opened between us. I rang the doorbell, footsteps approached. The door opened 6 inches, chain still engaged, and Jason's face appeared in the gap, hard and unfamiliar. I asked you not to contact us, he said. Jason, please, I said, my voice breaking despite my intentions. I don't understand what's happening. What did I do? This isn't about you, he replied, which was the kind of thing people said when something was absolutely about you. Michelle and I have made a decision about the direction of our family. We need space from toxic influences. Toxic influences. I repeated, the words foreign in my mouth. I'm your mother. Biology doesn't obligate us to accept harmful relationships, he said, and I recognized the language, the therapy speak that suggested he'd been coaching himself for this conversation. We're setting boundaries. Boundaries around what? I asked, desperation making my voice sharp. I haven't done anything, except care about you, and love you and try to support you. That's your perspective, he said. Our perspective is different. Then help me understand your perspective, I pleaded. Let me in. Let's talk about this like adults. There's nothing to discuss. Please respect our decision and don't come back here. He closed the door. I stood on the porch, staring at the painted wood, at the brass knocker shaped like a pineapple that Michelle had been so excited to find at an estate sale. I'd been with her that day, had shared her delight, had felt like I was part of something, a family expanding and strengthening. Now I was on the wrong side of a locked door, excommunicated without trial. I drove home in a daze, running red lights I didn't see, taking turns on autopilot. Back in my quiet house, the one that still felt too big without David, I sat at the kitchen table and tried to think rationally. Something was wrong. Not just with our relationship, but with Jason's behavior. The secrecy about Cascade Holdings. The sudden complete rejection, the rehearsed phrases about boundaries and toxic influences. This wasn't my son, this was someone scared, or hiding something or both. I opened my laptop and did what any mother in the digital age would do when cut off from her child. I searched. Cascade Holdings came up immediately. A real estate investment company, based in Seattle, specializing in commercial property acquisitions and redevelopment. Nothing inherently suspicious, except I couldn't find any connection to bakeries or food service or anything that would make sense for Jason to be involved with. I kept digging, following links, cross-referencing business filings. And then I found it. A recent article in the Puget Sound Business Journal about Cascade Holdings' latest acquisition. They'd purchased a historic building in the International District. The building that housed Chen's bakery. My building, except it wasn't mine anymore. I'd transferred ownership to Jason 5 years ago, as part of my retirement, along with the business itself. A clean handoff, or so I'd thought, keeping everything in the family. But if Cascade Holdings had purchased the building, that meant Jason had sold it. Sold the property my parents had scrimped and saved to buy in 1968. Sold it without telling me. I called my attorney, Patricia Lim, who'd handled my estate planning and business affairs for 20 years. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm with familiarity. Maggie, good morning. What can I do for you? I need you to pull some records for me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Property records and business filings for Chen's bakery. Something's not right. Patricia's tone shifted to professional concern. What kind of not right? The kind where my son just cut me out of his life, and I think he's sold the family business without telling me. There was a pause. I'll look into it today. Can you come to my office this afternoon? Say 3 o'clock. I'll be there. The hours until 3 stretched like taffy. I tried to distract myself with housework, with television, with anything that would stop my mind from spinning through worst-case scenarios. But nothing worked. I kept returning to my phone, checking for messages from Jason that never came, rereading that cold text. You're not family anymore. At 3, I sat across from Patricia in her downtown office, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering views of Elliott Bay, ferries cutting white lines across blue water. She had a file folder in front of her, thicker than I'd expected. "Tell me what you found," I said. Patricia opened the folder, her expression carefully neutral in the way of lawyers delivering bad news. The building was sold 8 months ago to Cascade Holdings for $4.2 million. The business itself, Chen's Bakery, was sold to a regional restaurant group called Emerald City Hospitality for $1.8 million. Both transactions went through quietly, minimal public record. $6 million, I said, my mouth dry. He sold everything for $6 million. Not quite everything, Patricia continued. He retained the Chen's Bakery name and branding, licensed back to Emerald City Hospitality for a nominal annual fee. So the business continues to operate under the same name, but it's no longer family-owned in any meaningful sense. I felt dizzy, untethered. When did this happen? How did this happen without me knowing? You signed over complete ownership 5 years ago, Patricia reminded me gently. Jason had no legal obligation to inform you or get your approval. As far as the law is concerned, those were his assets to dispose of as he chose. But morally, I said, hearing the weakness in my own argument. Ethically, I'm your attorney, not a philosopher, Patricia said, not unkindly. But yes, morally and ethically, this is questionable at best. The business was a family legacy. You trusted him to preserve it. Where did the money go? I asked. $6 million doesn't just disappear. Patricia flipped to another page in the folder. That's where it gets more interesting. I found liens against Jason and Michelle's personal property. Their house, their cars, even some personal possessions. They're heavily leveraged, Maggie. Credit card debt in the high 6 figures, a second mortgage they took out last year, multiple personal loans. My son, the business school graduate, who'd always been so careful with money, was drowning in debt. And he'd sold the family legacy to try to stay afloat. Did the $6 million cover it?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
None of them particularly ethical. All of them legally gray at best. Can we do anything? I asked. Is there any way to challenge the sale, to get the business back? Patricia's expression was sympathetic but firm. Not legally. No. You transferred full ownership. Jason had every right to sell. The only recourse you might have is if you can prove fraud or undue influence in the original transfer, but that's a very high bar and frankly unlikely to succeed, given that you voluntarily signed over the business. So I have no legal standing. No legal standing, Patricia confirmed. This is a family matter now, not a legal one. Except I don't have a family anymore, I said, bitterness creeping into my voice. According to my son, I'm not family. I left Patricia's office with copies of everything she'd found, documents that proved my son had dismantled 70 years of family history to pay off debts I hadn't known existed. I drove home through Seattle traffic, barely seeing the road, my mind consumed with a single question. What now? I'd lost David to cancer, something unavoidable and cruel, but at least comprehensible. This loss felt different, more painful in some ways, because it was a choice. Jason had chosen to sell the bakery, chosen to hide his debts, chosen to cut me off rather than ask for help, or even tell me the truth. And I'd been so carefully kept in the dark that I hadn't seen any of it coming. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the documents Patricia had given me spread out before me, studying transactions and dates and numbers that told the story of my son's desperation and deception. The building had sold 8 months ago. The business 6 months ago. The money had flowed immediately into debt payments, barely making a dent in what Jason owed. My phone rang, an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Mrs. Chen, a woman's voice, professional but tentative. Yes? My name is Angela Reeves. I'm a financial advisor with Northwind Wealth Management. I'm calling about a somewhat delicate matter regarding your son Jason Chen. My guard went up immediately. What about him? I've been working with Jason and his wife for the past year, trying to help them restructure their debt situation. I realize I'm probably overstepping, but I think you should know that they're in serious financial trouble. The sale of the bakery business bought them some time, but not enough. They're facing potential bankruptcy within the next few months. Why are you telling me this? I asked. If you're their advisor, shouldn't this be confidential? It should be, she admitted. But Jason listed you as his emergency contact on his initial paperwork, and I've been trying to reach him for 3 weeks without success. He's not returning calls, not responding to emails. I'm concerned he's given up and is just letting everything collapse. 3 weeks. That would have been right around when I'd asked him about Cascade Holdings, when I'd seen those spreadsheets with the red numbers. What happens if he declares bankruptcy? I asked. He loses everything, Angela said bluntly. The house, the cars, any remaining assets. His credit is destroyed for years, and depending on how some of these loans were structured, there might be legal consequences. Some of the debt was secured with personal guarantees that could be considered fraudulent if he knew he couldn't pay them back. Legal consequences, I repeated. You mean criminal charges? Potentially. I'm not an attorney, but I've seen cases where aggressive creditors push for fraud charges when the amounts are this large. How large are we talking? Between the remaining mortgage debt, the personal loans, the credit cards, and some private notes I'm seeing, probably close to $3 million. $3 million. My son owed $3 million, had sold the family business for $6 million, and was still drowning. Mrs. Chen, Angela continued, I know this isn't my place, but I've been in this business for 15 years. I've seen families destroyed by situations like this. If there's any way you can talk to Jason, convince him to face this head-on instead of hiding, it might not be too late to salvage something. He won't talk to me, I said quietly. He's cut me off completely. Then maybe it's time to make him talk, she suggested. Sometimes people need to be forced to confront reality before they'll accept help. After I hung up, I sat in the darkness of my kitchen, streetlights casting long shadows through the windows. My son had sold my family's legacy, accumulated millions in debt I didn't understand, and then cut me out of his life entirely rather than face what he'd done. The old Maggie, the one who'd existed before that 2:17 a.m. text message, would have been paralyzed by hurt and confusion, would have respected his boundaries, given him space, hoped he'd eventually come around. But that Maggie was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone who'd learned in the course of a single day that love and trust could be weapons used against you. Jason wanted me out of his life. Fine. But he was about to discover that being family came with obligations as well as benefits, and removing me from the family album didn't erase 70 years of legacy. He'd traded away for temporary relief from debts I was only beginning to understand. I opened my laptop and started making a list. Names, numbers, connections. Patricia's contact information at the top, followed by Angela Reeves. I added the names of creditors I'd seen in the documents. The Cascade Holdings partners, the Emerald City Hospitality executives, who now owned what used to be Chen's bakery. Then I added one more name, Kevin Zhang, an investigative journalist I'd met years ago through David, who specialized in business fraud and white-collar crime. If Jason had gotten himself into something criminal, I needed to know the full scope of it, not to protect him this time. To understand what I was dealing with. Because my son had made a critical error in his calculations, he'd assumed that cutting me off would end my involvement in his life, would leave him free to manage his crisis in whatever misguided way he'd chosen. But I was Margaret Chen, daughter of immigrants, who'd built something from nothing, widow of a man who'd taught me that integrity mattered more than ease, mother of a son who'd forgotten where he came from. Jason had texted me at 2:17 in the morning to tell me I wasn't family anymore. He was about to learn that family was exactly what I was, and that came with consequences he clearly hadn't anticipated. I had no legal standing to challenge what he'd done. Patricia had made that clear, but I had something potentially more powerful. I had information, connections, and a lifetime of experience in building and protecting what mattered. My son thought he could erase me with a text message and a locked door. He was wrong. I picked up my phone and started making calls. First to Kevin Zhang, who answered even though it was nearly midnight. His curiosity immediately piqued when I mentioned fraud and family businesses. Then to several of my parents' old friends, people who'd known the bakery since its founding, who'd celebrated birthdays and weddings and graduations with our pastries, who might have information about what had happened to their beloved neighborhood institution. Each call revealed another piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Wu from the herb shop next door told me the bakery had changed its recipes, that the char didn't taste the same anymore, that regular customers were disappointed.
That Mr.
Tanaka, who'd supplied our produce for 40 years, said his contract hadn't been renewed, that Emerald City Hospitality was using cheaper suppliers. The building superintendent mentioned that Cascade Holdings had raised rents on other tenants, forcing some longtime businesses to relocate. Jason hadn't just sold the family business, he'd allowed it to be gutted, transformed into something unrecognizable, all while keeping the Chen name on the sign, to maintain the illusion of continuity. By 2 a.m, 8 hours after that cold text message had upended my world, I had a plan, not revenge. Exactly, though I wouldn't pretend there wasn't satisfaction in contemplating it. Justice, perhaps. Or simply the natural consequences of choices made in desperation and hidden behind lies. Jason had wanted to move forward without my negativity in his life. I was about to show him what my absence really looked like, what happened when the safety net he'd taken for granted disappeared completely. He'd texted me that I wasn't family anymore. I was about to make his family problems very real indeed. Kevin Zhang arrived at my house the next morning with a leather messenger bag, and the kind of eager energy that made him excellent at his job. He'd been investigating financial fraud for the Seattle Times for nearly a decade, and his work had put 3 white-collar criminals in prison. David had introduced us at a fundraiser years ago, back when my biggest concern was whether the bakery's new ovens would arrive on schedule. I made coffee while Kevin set up his laptop at my dining room table, the morning light streaming through windows that overlooked the Japanese maple David had planted the year before he died. Strange how grief could ambush you at the oddest moments. Not when you expected it, but when you were pouring coffee for a journalist who was about to help you investigate your own son. "Walk me through everything," Kevin said, opening a fresh notebook. "Start from the beginning." I told him about the text message, about Jason's refusal to speak with me, about the discovery that he'd sold both the building and the business. I showed him Patricia's documents, the property records, the business filings. Kevin took notes in shorthand, occasionally asking questions that revealed how quickly his mind was working through the implications. "This Cascade Holdings," he said, tapping his pen against the notebook. "Your son is listed as a managing partner, but who are the other partners?" "I don't know," I admitted. Patricia couldn't find much beyond the basic filing information. Kevin's fingers flew across his keyboard. "Give me a minute." I sipped my coffee and watched him work, thinking about how surreal this moment was. 24 hours ago, I'd been a retired widow with a generally pleasant life, volunteering at the community center, having lunch with friends, visiting my grandchildren. Now I was sitting across from an investigative journalist, trying to unravel what my son had done with 70 years of family history. "Interesting," Kevin murmured, leaning closer to his screen. "Very interesting. What did you find?" "Cascade Holdings has 3 managing partners. Your son Jason, a man named Derek Paulson, and someone named Marcus Webb. Paulson has a history, Maggie. He was involved in a real estate scandal in Portland 5 years ago. Never charged with anything, but his name came up in connection with some predatory lending practices, targeting immigrant business owners. My stomach tightened. Jason was in business with someone who preyed on people like my parents. It gets worse, Kevin continued, still scrolling. Marcus Webb filed for bankruptcy 3 years ago. Lost everything in a cryptocurrency scheme that collapsed. These are not the kind of partners you want if you're trying to run a legitimate real estate investment company. "I'm not sure I want attention," I said. "I just want to understand what happened and why. Then let me do some more digging," Kevin suggested. "Off the record for now, I'll look into Cascade Holdings, into these partners, into the financial structure of everything Jason's done. Give me a week and I'll have a clearer picture of exactly what kind of trouble he's in." After Kevin left, I sat alone in my dining room, surrounded by the life David and I had built together. Photos on the walls showing Jason at various ages, always smiling, always seemingly happy. His high school graduation, his college graduation, his wedding to Michelle, the birth of my grandchildren. When had it all gone wrong? When had my son become someone who would sell his heritage and then cut off his mother rather than face what he'd done? My phone rang. Patricia, Maggie, I have some news. Not good news, I'm afraid. I braced myself. What is it? I've been looking deeper into Jason's financial situation. There's a lawsuit that was filed yesterday. One of the creditors, a private lender called Meridian Capital, is suing him for defaulting on a loan for $800,000. The filing includes some details about how the loan was secured. How was it secured? Patricia paused. With your name, Maggie. He used your identity as a co-signer without your knowledge or permission. The room tilted. He forged my signature? It appears so. The loan documents have your signature on them, but you obviously didn't sign them. That's identity theft, Maggie. It's a serious crime. Can they come after me? I asked, panic rising. Am I liable for his debt? Normally, yes, a co-signer would be liable. But since you didn't actually sign, since your signature was forged, you're not legally responsible. However, you'll need to file a police report documenting the identity theft. That's the only way to protect yourself from potential collection attempts. A police report meant officially accusing my son of a crime. It meant involving law enforcement in what was already a nightmare. But what choice did I have? I'll do it, I said, my voice hollow. Send me whatever documentation you have. There's one more thing, Patricia said, and I could hear the reluctance in her voice. The lawsuit filing is public record. It's going to draw attention, Maggie. Other creditors are going to see it and probably file their own suits. This is going to get very public very quickly. After hanging up with Patricia, I drove to the police station in a daze. The officer who took my report was young, professional, and clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamics involved. He took my statement, examined the loan documents Patricia had sent, and explained that the case would be forwarded to the fraud division for investigation. Your son could face criminal charges, the officer said gently. Identity theft, forgery, fraud. These are serious offenses, ma'am. I understand, I said, though I didn't. Not really. How could I understand that my son, my only child, was apparently a criminal? I drove home through Seattle's afternoon traffic, past the Space Needle and Pike Place Market, past the waterfront where David and I used to walk on weekends, past the life I'd thought I understood. My phone kept buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored them all. At home, I found my laptop open to Facebook, where I'd apparently forgotten to log out. Jason's page was still accessible to me, not yet blocked the way his phone number was. I knew I shouldn't look, knew it would only hurt more, but I couldn't help myself. His most recent post was from 3 days ago. A family photo, Jason and Michelle with my grandchildren, all smiling in front of their Craftsman house. The caption read, "Sometimes you have to cut out toxic people to protect your peace and your family's well-being. Here's to new beginnings and healthier boundaries." The comments were full of support from friends who had no idea what was really happening. So proud of you. Family isn't always blood. You deserve to be happy. I was the toxic person he was cutting out. I was the threat to his family's well-being, and his friends were congratulating him for it. I closed the laptop before I could read more, before I could see how thoroughly he'd rewritten our story to make himself the victim and me the villain. My phone rang again. This time I recognized the number. Angela Reeves, the financial advisor. Mrs. Chen, I'm so glad you answered. Have you seen the lawsuit filing? I just found out about it, I said. From my attorney. Then you know this is going to trigger a cascade effect. Other creditors are going to file suits now. Jason's going to be facing multiple legal actions, probably within days. Why are you telling me this? I asked again. You're his advisor, not mine, because he's not responding to me, Angela said, frustration clear in her voice. And because I've been in this business long enough to know when someone's given up. Jason has given up. Mrs. Chen, he's not fighting anymore. He's just waiting for everything to collapse. What do you want me to do about it? He won't talk to me. I want you to consider something, Angela said. What if this isn't about you at all? What if Jason cut you off because he's ashamed? Because he knows what he's done, and can't face telling you? That doesn't excuse forging my signature. I pointed out. That doesn't excuse selling the family business without telling me. No, it doesn't, Angela agreed, but it might explain why he's refusing to communicate. Sometimes people shut down completely when they're drowning. They stop answering calls, stop opening mail, stop dealing with reality, because reality has become too overwhelming. I thought about this, about Jason's drawn face when he'd opened the door with the chain still engaged, about the rehearsed phrases about toxic influences and boundaries. Had those been defense mechanisms? Ways to keep me at a distance because he couldn't bear to admit what he'd done. Even if that's true, I said slowly, I don't know how to reach him. He's made it very clear he doesn't want contact. Then maybe it's time to stop trying to reach him directly, Angela suggested. Maybe it's time to deal with the situation he's created, and let the consequences speak for themselves. After hanging up, I sat in my living room as evening shadows lengthened across the floor. The house was too quiet, the way it had been in the months after David died, before I'd learned to fill the silence with audiobooks and television, and anything that made it feel less empty. But this silence was different. This was the silence of having been purposefully shut out, of having lost access to the people who made the noise that mattered. My son, my daughter-in-law, my grandchildren, all gone, excised from my life with a text message and a locked door. My laptop chimed with an email notification. Kevin Zhang. The subject line read, "You need to see this." I opened the email to find a link to a public records database. Kevin had found the full partnership agreement for Cascade Holdings, including financial projections and planned uses for the properties they'd acquired. The building that had housed Chen's bakery was slated for demolition. In its place, Cascade Holdings planned to build a mixed-use development with luxury condos and high-end retail. Construction was scheduled to begin in 6 months. They were going to tear down my parents' building, the place where my mother had folded dumplings at 4 in the morning, where my father had served customers with patient dignity, even when they were rude, where I'd learned what it meant to build something from nothing. Jason had sold it knowing it would be destroyed. I called Kevin immediately. Did you know about this? Did Jason know they were planning to demolish the building? I can't prove Jason knew, Kevin said carefully, but the partnership agreement was signed 2 years ago. Maggie, before he sold the building. So either he knew, and didn't care, or he didn't bother to read what he was signing, which is almost worse. 2 years. Jason had been planning this for 2 years, had been involved with these partners for 2 years, and I'd had no idea. I'd been visiting the bakery, chatting with staff, thinking everything was fine while my son was engineering its destruction. There's more, Kevin continued. I talked to some of the other property owners in the International District. Cascade Holdings has been buying up buildings systematically, always using the same approach. They target family-owned businesses, usually immigrant families, usually older owners looking to retire. They make generous offers, promise to preserve the neighborhood character, then flip the properties for development. They're gentrifying the neighborhood, I said, understanding dawning. They're pushing out the families who built it. Exactly, Kevin confirmed, and your son is part of it. He's not just a victim of bad partners, Maggie, he's an active participant in displacing the exact kind of families your parents were. The irony is almost painful. I felt sick. My son, raised on stories of immigrant struggle, benefiting from sacrifices made by people who'd arrived with nothing, was now part of a machine that pushed those same kinds of people out of their community. What can I do? I asked Kevin. How do I stop this? Legally, Kevin said. Probably nothing. The sales are completed. The development plans are filed. Unless there's evidence of fraud in how the properties were acquired, which would be hard to prove, this is all technically legal. Morally reprehensible, but legal. So they just win. They tear down my parents' building and put up luxury condos. And that's it. Not necessarily, Kevin said, and I could hear the calculation in his voice. The Planning Commission has to approve the demolition and new construction. There's a public comment period. If the community pushes back, if there's enough negative attention on Cascade Holdings and their practices, the commission might deny the permits, or at least delay them significantly. You want to write about this? I realized, you want to make it a story. I think it already is a story, Kevin said. The article opened with my parents' story, their arrival in Seattle, their struggle to establish the bakery, the significance of eventually owning their building. Then it detailed how Jason had sold both the business and property to Cascade Holdings, who planned to demolish the building for luxury development. Kevin had woven in the broader pattern of Cascade Holdings targeting similar immigrant-owned properties throughout the International District. My son's name appeared throughout the article, always with the context that he was my son, that he'd inherited this business from his immigrant grandparents, that he was now participating in the kind of displacement his own family had once feared. The article was fair but devastating. Kevin had included a quote from Derek Paulson defending the development as progress and economic growth. He'd noted that neither Jason nor Marcus Webb had responded to multiple requests for comment, and he'd ended with my quote, the one I'd agonized over for an hour before approving. My parents built something they hoped would last for generations, I'd said. They believed that in America, if you worked hard enough, you could create security for your family. My son is teaching me that sometimes your own family is what destroys what you've built. I read the article 3 times, each time feeling the weight of what I was about to do. This would be public, permanent. Everyone would know what Jason had done, how he'd betrayed his heritage. There would be consequences I couldn't predict, couldn't control. My phone rang. Patricia. Maggie, I just got a call from an attorney representing Jason. They're threatening to sue you for defamation if you go public with accusations against him. I haven't made any accusations, I said. I've just told the truth to a journalist. They're also threatening to get a restraining order against you if you continue what they're calling harassment. I haven't contacted Jason in days, I pointed out. He's the one who cut me off, remember? I know, Patricia said. I think they're panicking. The lawsuit from Meridian Capital has spooked them. They know other creditors are going to pile on. They're trying to control the narrative before it gets away from them completely. Well, it's too late, I said. The article runs tomorrow. Are you sure about this, Maggie? Patricia asked gently. Once it's out there, you can't take it back. I'm sure, I said, and surprised myself by meaning it. Sunday morning arrived with rain, typical for Seattle in November, the kind of gray drizzle that could last for days. I made coffee and retrieved the newspaper from my front porch, the physical act of unfolding the paper and seeing my parents' photo above the fold making everything suddenly terribly real. There they were, younger than I'd ever known them, standing in front of their bakery in 1952, my mother in an apron, my father in a white shirt, both of them smiling with the kind of hope that only immigrants who'd escaped war and poverty could understand. And beneath their photo, the story of how their grandson had sold what they'd built. My phone started ringing at 7 in the morning, friends who'd seen the article asking if I was okay, expressing outrage on my behalf, former bakery employees thanking me for speaking up, for honoring my parents' memory, neighbors from the International District who'd known my family for decades, offering support and sharing their own stories of pressure from developers. By noon, the article had been shared thousands of times on social media. Local news stations were calling, wanting interviews. A community organization dedicated to preserving the International District's character contacted me about testifying at the Planning Commission hearing. And then at 2 in the afternoon, my phone rang with a number I'd blocked, but that somehow got through anyway. Jason. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the decline button. Part of me wanted to answer, desperate to hear his voice even if it was raised in anger. Part of me knew that whatever he had to say would only make this worse. I answered, how could you? His voice was ragged, broken in a way I'd never heard before. How could you do this to me? To your own son? I think you have that backwards, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. You're the one who did this, Jason. To yourself, to me, to your grandparents' legacy. I just told the truth about it. You told your version of the truth, he shot back. You made me look like a monster in the newspaper. Do you have any idea what this is doing to my life? Michelle's family is furious. My kids' friends' parents are calling them the children of the guy who betrayed his immigrant grandparents. I can't show my face anywhere. You couldn't show your face before the article. I pointed out, that's why you've been hiding, ignoring your financial advisor, refusing to deal with reality. This is different, he said, and his voice cracked. This is public humiliation. This is my name in the paper, attached to words like greed and betrayal and displacement. Those are accurate words, I said, quietly. You were greedy, Jason. You did betray us. You are participating in displacement. The article didn't make those things true, it just made them visible. I had reasons, he said desperately. You don't understand the pressure I was under, the debt, the partners who promised they could help me, the mistakes that just kept compounding. I never meant for any of this to happen, but it did happen, I said. And when it did, instead of coming to me, instead of asking for help, or even just telling me the truth, you sold everything and then cut me out of your life. You sent me a text message at 2 in the morning, telling me I wasn't family anymore, Jason. So forgive me if I don't feel particularly sympathetic to your current problems. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear his breathing, ragged and uneven. I was ashamed, he finally said, so quietly, I almost didn't hear him. I was drowning, and I was ashamed, and I couldn't face telling you what I'd done. It was easier to push you away than to admit I'd failed. The admission hit me harder than his anger had. This was what Angela had suggested, that Jason's cruelty had been born of shame rather than malice. But knowing the reason didn't undo the damage. Shame doesn't excuse what you did, I said. It doesn't excuse forging my signature, selling your grandparents' business, participating in something that goes against everything our family stood for. I know, he whispered. I know that now, but Mom, please, is there any way to undo this? To stop the article, to make this go away? The article already ran, Jason. It's online, it's been shared thousands of times, local news is covering it. There's no making it go away. He made a sound that might have been a sob. Then I'm ruined. My reputation, my business, everything. You've destroyed me. No, I said firmly, you destroyed yourself. I just stopped pretending it wasn't happening. I hung up before he could respond, before my resolve could weaken, before the maternal instinct to comfort could override the necessity of consequence. My hands were shaking, my eyes were hot with tears I wouldn't let fall. But underneath the pain, there was something else. Something that felt almost like relief. For the first time since that 2:17 a.m. text message, I'd spoken my truth to my son. I'd held him accountable. I'd refused to absorb his shame as if it were my own. It didn't feel good, exactly, but it felt necessary. The doorbell rang. I wiped my eyes and went to answer it, expecting another journalist or perhaps a neighbor checking on me. Instead, I found Michelle, my daughter-in-law, standing on my porch in the rain. Her eyes were red, her face pale, and she was alone. Can I come in? She asked quietly. Please? I stepped aside and let Michelle enter, watching her drip rainwater onto my hardwood floors. She'd always been meticulous about such things, always removing her shoes, always careful not to track dirt. Now she stood in my entryway, in soaking wet sneakers, looking lost. I'll get you a towel, I said, moving toward the linen closet. When I returned, she was sitting on my couch, staring at her hands. I handed her the towel and sat in the chair across from her, maintaining distance. Whatever she'd come to say, I needed to be clear-headed for it. I didn't know, Michelle said finally, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes, about any of it. The debt, the partners, the sale of the bakery. Jason kept it all from me. I thought we were doing well. I thought the money from his business ventures was legitimate profit. I studied her carefully, looking for signs of deception. Michelle had always been hard to read, polished and controlled in a way that came from her upbringing in a wealthy suburb. But right now, she looked genuinely shattered. How could you not know your husband owed $3 million? I asked, keeping my tone neutral rather than accusatory. Separate finances, she said with a bitter laugh. Jason insisted on it, when we got married, said it was modern, that it gave us both independence. I had my salary from the marketing firm. He had his income from the bakery and his investments. We each contributed to a joint account for household expenses, but everything else was separate. I never saw his bank statements, never saw credit card bills. He said he was handling everything, and you never questioned that, never wondered where the money was coming from for the house renovations, the private school tuition, the vacations. Michelle's jaw tightened. Of course I questioned it. But Jason always had explanations. The bakery was doing well, his investments were paying off. He was good at business, better than his mother who'd been content to run a small neighborhood shop instead of expanding. That's what he told me. The casual cruelty of that statement, the dismissal of everything I'd built, stung more than it should have. But I kept my expression neutral. So why are you here, Michelle? To tell me you're innocent? To ask me to retract the article? Neither, she said quietly. I'm here because I'm leaving him. I filed for separation this morning. I'm taking the kids to my parents' house in Bellevue. And I thought you should know that not everyone in Jason's life abandoned him because they wanted to. Some of us were lied to, just like you were. I absorbed this information, trying to understand what it meant. Michelle was leaving Jason in the middle of his crisis, when he was facing lawsuits and criminal investigations and public humiliation. Does he know? I asked. I told him an hour ago, right before he called you. Actually, that's probably why he sounded so desperate. She pulled the towel tighter around her shoulders. I'm not proud of the timing, Maggie. I know how it looks, leaving when he's at his lowest. But I can't do this anymore. I can't be married to someone who lies about everything, who forges his own mother's signature, who sells out his family's legacy for money he used to pay off debts I didn't even know existed. What about the children? I asked, thinking of my grandchildren, 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Lucas, who'd been kept from me for weeks now. They're confused and scared, Michelle admitted. Emma keeps asking why we can't see Grandma anymore. I've been telling her you're busy, that you're traveling, anything to avoid explaining that their father cut you out of our lives without telling me why. Now she's going to have to deal with her parents separating, with moving, with all of this being public. Her voice cracked on that last word, and I saw genuine anguish in her face. Whatever else Michelle might be, she loved her children, that much was clear. I want you to see them, Michelle said suddenly. Emma and Lucas, they miss you, and they shouldn't be punished for what Jason did. I asked directly, why are you really here? She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers twisting the edge of the towel. I want you to know that I see what Jason did, she said finally. I see how wrong it was. And I want you to know that I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner, that I didn't question more, that I let him isolate you from us. She paused, then added, and I guess I want to know if there's any way to fix this. Any way to salvage something from this disaster. The bakery's gone, I said bluntly. The building's going to be demolished. Jason's facing criminal charges for identity theft. He's being sued by multiple creditors. His partners are probably going to throw him under the bus to save themselves. What exactly do you think can be fixed? I don't know, Michelle whispered. Maybe nothing. Maybe it's all too broken. But I keep thinking about Emma and Lucas, about what they're going to grow up knowing about their father, about their family history. And I want them to know that not everyone in this family is a liar and a cheat. I want them to know their grandmother is someone with integrity, even when that integrity costs her everything. The raw honesty of her words surprised me. This was not the polished, controlled Michelle I'd known for 12 years. This was someone whose life had just exploded, who was scrambling to understand the debris. You can bring them to see me, I said after a moment. Not at Jason's house. Here, this weekend if you want. Michelle's expression flooded with relief. Thank you, Maggie. Really, thank you. After she left, I sat alone in my living room, trying to process this new development. Michelle was leaving Jason. My grandchildren would be living in Bellevue with their maternal grandparents. The family structure I'd taken for granted had completely dissolved in less than 3 weeks. My phone buzzed with a text from Kevin. The Planning Commission moved up the public hearing on Cascade Holdings demolition permits. It's this Thursday at 7. Will you testify? I typed back. Yes. Over the next 3 days, I prepared my testimony with the same care I'd once used to plan business strategy. Kevin helped me understand the process, what the commissioners would want to hear, how to make my case both personal and relevant to broader community concerns. The International District Community Organization, led by a fierce woman named Susan Park, coordinated with other property owners and longtime residents who wanted to speak against the demolition. We met Tuesday evening in the basement of a community center, a dozen people around a folding table, sharing stories of displacement and gentrification. of developers who promised preservation and delivered luxury condos. Your situation is particularly compelling, Susan told me after the meeting. The generational aspect, the immigrant legacy, the family betrayal, it hits all the emotional notes that might actually make the commissioners think twice. I don't want to exploit my parents' story, I said uncomfortably, or turn this into some kind of melodrama. It's already dramatic, Susan pointed out gently. That's the reality of what's happening to our neighborhood. Your family's story represents dozens of other families who don't have a platform to speak from. If you can make the commissioners understand what's being lost, you might be able to save not just your parents' building, but others too. Thursday evening arrived cold and clear. I dressed carefully in a navy suit, professional but not flashy, the kind of outfit my mother would have approved of for important occasions. I drove to City Hall with a folder containing old photos of the bakery, newspaper clippings about my parents, documentation of the building's historical significance. The hearing room was packed. I recognized faces from the neighborhood, other business owners, community activists, and in the back row, partially hidden behind a pillar, I saw Jason. He looked terrible, unshaven, rumpled, his eyes hollow. When our gazes met, he didn't look away, but there was something in his expression I couldn't read. Shame, defiance, desperation. I turned back to the front of the room as the commissioners filed in. The hearing followed a predictable structure. Cascade Holdings attorney presented first, emphasizing economic growth, job creation, increased property values, neighborhood revitalization. He made the demolition sound like civic duty, tearing down the old to make way for progress. Then the opposition speakers began. Susan Park spoke about displacement and cultural erasure. An elderly man who'd run a tailor shop for 40 years talked about rising rents forcing out longtime tenants. A young woman described growing up in the International District and returning from college to find her childhood neighborhood unrecognizable. And then it was my turn. I walked to the podium, placed my folder on the lectern and looked at the 5 commissioners. 4 were attentive. One was checking his phone. My name is Margaret Chen, I began. My parents Chen Wei and Chen Mei opened Chen's Bakery in 1952 with their life savings. They had arrived in America 3 years earlier with nothing. The bakery was their proof that the American dream existed, that hard work and determination could build security for future generations. I showed them a photo of my parents in front of their bakery, young and hopeful. The commissioner who'd been on his phone looked up. This building that Cascade Holdings wants to demolish isn't just property, I continued. It's a physical manifestation of immigrant achievement. It represents what people like my parents believed about America, that you could build something permanent, something that would outlast you, something that would tell your children and grandchildren that their family had made a mark. I paused, making sure I had their attention. My son Jason is one of the partners in Cascade Holdings. He inherited this business from me, and I inherited it from my parents. He sold it knowing it would be demolished. He participated in destroying his own heritage for profit. There was a murmur in the room. I saw the commissioners exchange glances. I'm not here to ask you to deny these permits, because my son betrayed me, though he did. I'm here to ask you to consider what message you send when you allow developers to systematically target immigrant-owned properties for demolition. What you're calling revitalization, many in this community call erasure. You're not just tearing down buildings. You're tearing down the physical evidence that immigrant families built this neighborhood, that we contributed to Seattle's history and economy and culture. The commissioner who'd been on his phone was now taking notes. Chen's Bakery isn't historically designated. I acknowledged. The building doesn't have architectural significance, but it has cultural significance. It has community significance. And there are dozens of buildings like it throughout the International District, all vulnerable to the same kind of predatory development, all at risk of being replaced by luxury housing that the families who built this neighborhood can't afford. I held up another photo, this one of my parents with customers, a multi-ethnic mix of faces from the 1970s. My parents served this neighborhood for decades. They hired people, they fed people, they were part of the social fabric. When you approve these demolition permits, you're saying that legacy doesn't matter. You're saying progress means erasing the past instead of building on it. I gathered my papers, preparing to step down, then turned back for one final point. One of the promises Cascade Holdings made when they bought these properties was that they would preserve neighborhood character. That was the language in their proposals. But you can't preserve character while demolishing the buildings that created it. You can't honor immigrant history while destroying the physical spaces where that history happened. I'm asking you to deny these permits, not out of nostalgia, but out of recognition that some things once lost can never be recovered. I returned to my seat in the audience, my heart pounding. I'd said what I needed to say. Whether it would make any difference remained to be seen. Several more speakers followed, echoing similar themes. When the public comment period closed, the commissioners conferred briefly, then announced they would take the matter under advisement and issue a decision within 30 days. As people filed out of the hearing room, several approached me to express support, to thank me for speaking, to share their own stories. I accepted their words with nods and brief responses, but my attention was on the back of the room, where Jason still stood. He waited until the room had mostly cleared, then approached me slowly, as if expecting me to flee. "That was a good speech," he said quietly. "Powerful. It was the truth." I replied. We stood in awkward silence for a moment. Up close, I could see how much weight he'd lost, the new lines around his eyes. "Michelle left me," he said finally. "Took the kids. I'm sure she told you." "She did." Another silence, heavier this time. "I'm going to lose everything," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The house, the business, probably my freedom if the DA pursues the identity theft charges. Everything I've built, gone. Everything you stole," I corrected. "Everything you built on lies and debt, and other people's trust." He flinched but didn't argue. "I know," he said. "I know what I did." "Chen, this is Derek Paulson from Cascade Holdings. I'd like to meet with you to discuss a potential resolution to this situation. Would you be available this afternoon?" I stared at the message, immediately suspicious. Derek Paulson, one of Jason's partners, the one with a history of predatory practices targeting immigrant business owners. What could he possibly want to discuss with me? I forwarded the message to Patricia with a question mark. She called me immediately. "Don't meet with him alone," she advised. "If you're going to meet with him at all, which I'd generally advise against, make sure I'm there and we record everything." I called Kevin next. He was even more wary. "Paulson's a snake, Maggie. Whatever he wants, it's not going to be in your best interest. He's probably trying to get you to back off before the commissioners make their decision." "But what if he's willing to negotiate something?" I asked. "What if there's a way to preserve the building?" "There's not," Kevin said flatly. "The demolition is the whole point of their business model. They buy properties cheap, tear them down, build expensive housing. That's how they make their profit. Paulson isn't going to suddenly develop a conscience and preserve your parents' building out of respect for heritage." Still, I decided to take the meeting. Patricia and I met Derek Paulson at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, neutral territory away from the International District. He arrived precisely on time, dressed in an expensive suit, carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Mrs. Chen, thank you for meeting with me," he said, extending his hand. "I know this situation has been difficult for everyone involved." I shook his hand briefly, then sat down without ordering anything. Patricia sat beside me, her laptop open, recording software running. "What do you want, Mr. Paulson?" I asked directly. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Direct. I appreciate that. Let me be direct too. Your testimony at the Planning Commission hearing was compelling. Too compelling, actually. We're concerned the commissioners might delay or deny our permits based on emotional rather than economic considerations. That's how democracy works," I pointed out. "Elected officials consider community input." Indeed, he agreed smoothly. "Which is why I'd like to propose a compromise that might address both our interests." He opened his portfolio and slid a document across the table. I glanced at it, then at Patricia, who was reading more carefully. "You're offering me money," I said, understanding immediately. "You want to pay me to withdraw my opposition." "Not exactly," Paulson said. "We're offering to create a memorial space in the new development, a small museum dedicated to the history of immigrant businesses in the International District, featuring your parents' story prominently, plus a substantial donation to a scholarship fund in their name for children of immigrant families. How substantial? Patricia asked, her tone neutral. $500,000, Paulson said. Plus naming rights. The Chen Family Scholarship Fund. It was a tempting offer, I had to admit. $500,000 could help a lot of young people, could honor my parents' legacy in a meaningful way. But it was also blood money, payment for allowing the destruction of what they'd actually built. And what do you get in return? I asked. You withdraw your opposition to the demolition permits, Paulson said simply. You make a statement supporting the development, emphasizing the memorial space and scholarship fund. You help us turn the narrative from destruction to preservation of memory. Preservation of memory instead of preservation of the actual building, Patricia said dryly. The building is just brick and mortar, Paulson argued. What matters is the story, the legacy. And we're offering to ensure that legacy lives on in a way that helps future generations. I looked at him, this smooth-talking man who made displacement sound like philanthropy, who wanted to erase my parents' building and replace it with a plaque. I thought about what my mother would say if she were here. She'd probably use some Cantonese phrase I'd been too Americanized to remember, something cutting and dismissive. No, I said simply. Paulson's smile faltered. Mrs. Chen, I don't think you understand the opportunity. I understand perfectly, I replied. You want to buy my silence and my complicity. You want to tear down my parents' building and salve your conscience with a scholarship fund. You want me to help you pretend that's the same thing as preservation. It's a generous offer, he said, an edge creeping into his voice. More generous than most people in your situation would receive. My situation, I repeated. You mean the situation where my son betrayed his family legacy by partnering with people like you? Where he sold out his heritage for money he used to cover debts he shouldn't have had. That situation, your son's choices are unfortunate, Paulson said carefully. But they're separate from this business discussion. Nothing is separate, I said, standing up. My son learned from people like you that everything has a price, that legacy and integrity are just obstacles to profit. I won't help you continue teaching that lesson. I gathered my things. Patricia closed her laptop, the recording saved. You're making a mistake, Paulson said, his smooth facade cracking. You think the commissioners will deny our permits based on one emotional testimony. They won't. Development always wins eventually. All you're doing is delaying the inevitable and missing out on a chance to get something positive from it. Maybe you're right, I said. Maybe I can't stop this. But I can make sure everyone knows exactly what you're doing and why. I can make sure the next neighborhood you target knows your pattern. I can make sure your name becomes associated with displacement instead of development. His expression hardened. That sounds like a threat, Mrs. Chen. It's a promise, I replied. You came after my family's legacy. Now I'm coming after yours. Patricia and I left the coffee shop, and I felt surprisingly energized rather than discouraged. Paulson had shown his hand. He was worried about the commissioner's decision, worried enough to offer a substantial bribe. That meant my testimony had mattered. Well, Patricia said as we walked to our cars, that was incredibly satisfying to watch. But Maggie, you should know that he's probably right about one thing. The commissioners usually side with developers eventually, especially when there's no legal basis to deny permits. I know, I said. But at least they'll have to justify it. At least it won't be easy. My phone rang, Susan Park from the community organization. Maggie, she said, excitement in her voice. 3 more property owners just called me. They saw your testimony, they're facing similar pressure from developers, and they want to fight back. You've started something here. I hadn't intended to start anything except understanding what had happened to my family. But maybe that was how change happened. One person refusing to accept the unacceptable, inspiring others to do the same. That evening, Emma and Lucas came to visit with Michelle. My grandchildren were tentative at first, unsure after weeks of separation. But Emma, always braver than her little brother, ran to me and wrapped her arms around my waist. Grandma, I missed you so much. Why did you go away? I didn't go away, sweetheart, I said, kneeling to her level. I've been right here. but sometimes grown-ups have problems they need to work out. Problems with daddy? Emma asked, too perceptive for 8. Yes, with your daddy, but that's not your fault, and it doesn't change how much I love you. Lucas, quieter and more sensitive, held Michelle's hand and watched me cautiously. I didn't push him, just smiled and offered my hand. After a moment he took it. We spent the evening doing simple things. Baking cookies, reading stories, playing board games. Normal grandmother activities that felt precious after their absence. Michelle stayed mostly quiet, letting me reconnect with the children, but I caught her watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read. After the kids were in bed, temporary pallets Michelle had set up in my guest room, she and I sat in my kitchen with tea. Thank you for this, she said quietly. For letting me bring them here. For not shutting us out the way Jason shut you out. You're not responsible for what Jason did, I replied. But I didn't stop it either, Michelle said. I should have paid more attention, asked more questions. I let myself be comfortable with not knowing. We all did things we regret, I said. The question is what we do now. Michelle nodded, cradling her tea mug. I'm filing for divorce, not just separation. I can't be married to someone I don't trust, someone who's facing criminal charges. The kids need stability, and Jason can't provide that right now. How is he? I asked. Surprising myself with the question. Honestly, Michelle said, I think he's having some kind of breakdown. He barely leaves his apartment. He's not working, not responding to his attorney, not dealing with any of the lawsuits. It's like he's given up completely. Part of me, the maternal part I couldn't completely silence, felt concern for Jason's mental state, but another part remembered his smug face at Derek Paulson's side in photos from business events, his willingness to sell out his heritage, his cruel text message cutting me from his life. He made his choices, I said. Now he has to live with them. I know, Michelle agreed. But Maggie, I worry about what Emma and Lucas are going to remember about all this. About their father, about family, about whether people can be trusted. Then we make sure they remember other things too, I suggested. This is huge. Do you know how rare it is for them to deny permits on a major development project? What happens now? I asked. Can Cascade Holdings appeal? They can and they will, Susan said. But every delay costs them money, erodes investor confidence, gives us time to build more opposition. This isn't over, but it's a major victory. After hanging up with Susan, I sat quietly at the table while Emma returned to her homework. A major victory, Susan had said, but it didn't feel victorious exactly. The bakery business was still gone, sold to Emerald City Hospitality, and operating under management that had changed the recipes, replaced the suppliers, turned my parents' legacy into a generic operation that just happened to carry the Chen name. The building might be saved, at least temporarily, but what filled it was no longer ours. Still, preservation was better than demolition. At least the physical space where my parents had worked, where I'd grown up, where 3 generations of stories had unfolded, would continue to exist. My phone rang. Kevin, have you seen the news? The commission denied the permits. This is incredible, Maggie. I said. What's Cascade Holdings saying? Radio silence so far, Kevin replied. But I've got a source at City Hall who told me the vote wasn't even close. 4-1 in favor of denial. Your testimony made the difference. Later that evening, after Michelle had collected the children and I was alone again, my phone rang with a number I'd blocked weeks ago, but that somehow still managed to get through. Jason. I stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to hear his reaction to the commission's decision. Part of me never wanted to speak to him again. I answered. I heard about the permits, he said without preamble. You must be pleased. I'm relieved, I corrected. There's a difference. Silence stretched between us, uncomfortable and heavy. Paulson is furious, Jason continued. He's blaming me for bringing you into this, for not managing the family situation better. Webb wants to cut me out of the partnership entirely. I'm being sued by 17 different creditors now. The DA's office sent a formal notice that they're moving forward with identity theft charges. His voice was flat, reciting disasters like someone reading a grocery list. The effect was concerning, the kind of emotional shutdown that spoke to something broken. Jason, I said carefully, are you okay? I mean really okay. He laughed, a bitter sound without humor. What do you think? I've lost everything. My wife, my kids, my business, my reputation. I'm probably going to prison. I'm living in a studio apartment in Renton because I can't afford anything better. Okay isn't a word that applies to my life anymore. Have you talked to anyone? I asked. A therapist, a counselor. Who's going to pay for that? My insurance is gone. I can barely afford food. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar pull of maternal instinct wanting to fix, to help, to ease his suffering, but I remembered Patricia's words, Michelle's observations, Susan's conviction. Enabling wasn't love. Protection wasn't support. Jason, I said firmly, you need help, real help, and I can't be the one to provide it anymore. I can give you the number for a sliding scale mental health clinic, but beyond that, you have to want to help yourself. So that's it, he said, anger finally entering his voice. Your son is falling apart and you're just going to let it happen. I didn't let anything happen, I replied. You created this situation through your choices. I'm sorry you're suffering. I genuinely am, but I can't rescue you from consequences you brought on yourself, even if those consequences destroy me. The same question he'd asked before, still looking for the answer he wanted rather than the truth he needed to hear. Consequences don't destroy people, Jason. They reveal who people really are. You can either let this define you as a victim, or you can use it to become someone different, someone better. That's your choice. He hung up without responding. I sat holding my phone, wondering if I'd just made the right decision or the cruelest one, if there was even a difference. 3 weeks after the commission's decision, Patricia called with another update on Jason's legal situation. The DA has offered a plea deal, she said. 3 years probation, full restitution to all parties harmed by the identity theft, mandatory financial counseling, and a suspended sentence contingent on compliance. No jail time if he stays clean. That's generous, I said, surprised. The DA told me off the record that they're sympathetic to the circumstances. Jason's cooperation has been complete. He's clearly remorseful, and sending him to prison wouldn't serve anyone's interests. But Maggie, there's a condition you need to know about. What condition? Part of the restitution Jason owes is to you, for the forged signature on the loan documents. The DA wants you to file a victim impact statement and specify what restitution you consider appropriate. I don't want his money, I said immediately. He doesn't have money to give. It's not about the money, Patricia explained. It's about accountability. The court needs you to quantify the harm done. You don't have to request actual payment, but you do need to document the impact of his actions on your life. Over the next week, I worked on the victim impact statement with Patricia's guidance. It was harder than I'd expected, distilling complex emotions and losses into clinical language, acceptable for legal proceedings. How did you measure the value of trust? How did you quantify the pain of being cut off from your grandchildren? How did you put a price on heritage betrayed? In the end, I wrote 3 pages. I described the forgery, the shock of discovering debts in my name, the fear of potential financial liability. I detailed the loss of the family business, not in dollar amounts, but in cultural and personal significance. I documented the weeks of separation from my grandchildren, the damage to my relationship with my son, the violation of trust that underpinned everything else. And at the end, I wrote what restitution I considered appropriate. Not money, but accountability. I requested that Jason be required to create a detailed oral history of Chen's bakery, documenting my parents' story, the business's history, and the neighborhood's evolution to be archived at the Wing-Luke Museum of the Asian Pacific American Experience. A record that would outlast all of us, that would ensure the legacy wasn't completely erased, even if the business had changed hands. Patricia read my statement and nodded approval. This is good, Maggie. It's personal but not vindictive. It holds him accountable while also giving him something constructive to do as part of his restitution. The plea hearing was scheduled for early December, nearly 2 months after that initial text message that had upended my world. I debated whether to attend. Patricia said my presence wasn't required since I'd submitted a written statement, but something drew me there anyway, a need to witness this final chapter. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, less dramatic than television had led me to believe. Jason sat at the defense table with his attorney, a public defender who looked overworked and underpaid. He'd lost more weight, his suit hanging loose on a frame that had once carried confidence. When my name was called to present my victim impact statement, I walked to the front of the courtroom and faced the judge, carefully not looking at Jason. The judge, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, read my statement carefully, asking occasional clarifying questions. When she finished, she looked at Jason directly. "Mr. Chen," she said, "your mother has requested something unusual as restitution. Not money, but memory. She's asking you to document and preserve the history of what you sold. Do you understand what that means?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jason said, his voice rough. "I understand. It means confronting what you've done. It means interviewing people who remember your grandparents, researching the neighborhood history, facing the legacy you betrayed. That's harder than writing a check. Are you willing to do that?" "I am," Jason said. "I want to do that." The judge accepted the plea agreement with its conditions, including my requested oral history project, 3 years probation, financial counseling, quarterly check-ins with a probation officer, and the oral history to be completed and submitted to the Wing Luke Museum within 1 year. As the hearing concluded and people filed out of the courtroom, Jason approached me hesitantly. "Your grandmother said he believed you didn't boast about doing what was right. You just did it." Jason's hand paused over his notebook. "That makes what I did even worse, doesn't it? Grandfather helped people. I helped displace them." "Yes," I said simply. "That's exactly what you did." He didn't defend himself, didn't make excuses. He just nodded and made another note. Near the end of our conversation, Jason looked up from his notebook with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I'm in therapy now," he said abruptly. "Found a clinic with sliding scale fees. My therapist says I have some kind of compulsive spending disorder, that I was using money and possessions to fill voids I didn't know how to deal with after Dad died." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "That might explain your choices, Jason, but it doesn't excuse them." "I know," he said. "That's what my therapist keeps saying too. Explanations aren't excuses. Understanding why you did something doesn't mean it's okay that you did it." The fact that he could articulate that distinction felt significant, a sign of growth I hadn't expected. "Are you working?" I asked, shifting to practical matters. "Part-time at a tax preparation place. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. I'm living pretty lean these days. No car, transit pass, cooking at home, library books instead of buying them. It's humbling. It's honest," I corrected. "Humbling would imply you didn't deserve this adjustment." "Fair point," he acknowledged with a ghost of a smile. When we parted, Jason asked if we could do another interview in a few weeks, after he'd conducted more research. I agreed, surprised to find that the conversation had been less painful than I'd anticipated. Maybe time was doing its work, or maybe I'd simply processed enough of the grief and anger that Jason's presence no longer felt like an open wound. Spring arrived in Seattle with its usual spectacular display of cherry blossoms and tulips. Susan Park called with news that Cascade Holdings was struggling financially, their development plans stalled by the permit denial, several investors pulling out, internal conflicts between the partners becoming public. "Derek Paulson and Marcus Webb are trying to force Jason out completely," she told me. "There's a lawsuit between the partners now, everyone blaming everyone else for the failed project." "What about the building?" I asked. "What happens to my parents' property?" "That's the interesting part," Susan said. "Cascade Holdings might have to sell to cover their debts, which means there could be an opportunity to buy it back, if you're interested." The possibility hadn't occurred to me. Buy back my parents' building, with what money? I was comfortable but not wealthy. My retirement savings carefully managed but not unlimited. "Think about it," Susan suggested. "I have some contacts with community development organizations. There might be ways to structure a purchase that preserves the building for community use, maybe creates affordable commercial space for immigrant-owned businesses. It would be poetic justice." Over the following weeks, I met with Susan's contacts, learning about community land trusts, nonprofit real estate models, creative financing structures. The more I learned, the more possible it seemed. Not to restore Chen's bakery exactly as it had been, but to ensure the building served a purpose my parents would have approved of. I called a family meeting of sorts, inviting Michelle and the children, asking Jason to join via video call since Michelle wasn't comfortable with him being there in person yet. I explained the opportunity to purchase the building, what it would mean, what it would require. I want your input, I told them. This affects all of you, even if indirectly. Emma and Lucas, this was your great-grandparents' building. Jason, you're the one who sold it. Michelle, the kids are your priority. Everyone gets a voice in this decision. Emma, now 9 and startlingly perceptive, spoke first. If we buy it back, can we make it a bakery again? Like great-grandma and great-grandpa had. Not exactly like they had it, I explained. But we could make sure it's used for something good, something that helps the neighborhood instead of replacing it. Then we should do it, Emma said with the kind of certainty only children possess. We should fix what Daddy broke. Jason's face on the laptop screen crumpled at her words, but he said nothing. Lucas, less concerned with legacy and more focused on immediate concerns, asked, "Will there be cookies?" Michelle laughed despite the seriousness of the conversation. Yes, Lucas, if Grandma does this, there will definitely be cookies. Jason, I said, looking at his image on the screen. You have thoughts. I think, he said carefully, that you should do whatever feels right to you, Mom. You've earned the right to make decisions about family legacy without consulting the person who nearly destroyed it. But you're still part of this family, I said, surprising myself with the words. Estranged, hurt, rebuilding trust that may never fully return, but still part of it. If you have an opinion, you can share it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then I think you should buy it, he said. I think you should save what I couldn't, and I think you should let me help. Not financially because I have nothing to contribute there, but with the work, the restoration, whatever needs doing. Let me be part of making it right. Michelle looked skeptical. Jason, you're still on probation. You can barely manage your own life right now. I know, he agreed, but the probation officer keeps talking about restorative justice, about repairing harm. Maybe this could be part of that. Helping restore what I helped destroy. I'll think about it, I said, which was becoming my standard response when Jason asked for things I wasn't ready to grant. The process of purchasing the building took months, complicated by Cascade Holdings partnership disputes, legal wrangling over who had authority to sell, negotiations with community development organizations providing partial financing. But by late summer, nearly a year after Jason's text message had fractured our family, I stood in front of my parents' building with a key in my hand, and tears streaming down my face. Susan Park stood beside me, along with representatives from 2 community organizations that had partnered on the purchase. Emma and Lucas were there, dressed up for the occasion, taking photos with Michelle's phone. Even Jason was there, keeping his distance but present, his oral history project nearly complete, his probation requirements being met consistently. This building, I said to the small crowd that had gathered for the informal ceremony, means different things to different people. To me, it's my parents' American dream made tangible. To this neighborhood, it's part of a history that's being erased by development and gentrification. To my grandchildren, it's a connection to ancestors they'll never meet. I looked at Jason, standing at the edge of the crowd, and to my son, it's a reminder that some mistakes cost more than money can repay. But that doesn't mean we stop trying to make amends. Jason met my eyes, nodded once, then looked away, his jaw tight with emotion. I unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The space was empty now. Emerald City Hospitality, having moved the bakery operation to a different location when their lease ended. But the bones of the building remained. My parents' building, saved from demolition, ready for a new chapter. Over the following months, volunteers worked to renovate the space. Jason showed up every weekend, doing manual labor, painting walls, repairing shelves, never asking for acknowledgement or praise. Michelle brought the children occasionally, letting them participate in age-appropriate ways, making memories in the space where their great-grandparents had made history. The final vision for the building emerged through community input. The ground floor would house a cooperative kitchen space, where immigrant entrepreneurs could start food businesses without the burden of full restaurant overhead. The second floor would become home to a nonprofit providing small business consulting and English language classes. And in a small corner of the ground floor, we created a permanent exhibit about the International District's history, featuring the oral history Jason had completed. The grand opening happened on a crisp October afternoon, almost exactly 1 year after I'd received that text message. The space was packed with neighbors, former bakery customers, community leaders, and several journalists, including Kevin Jiang, who'd followed the story from beginning to end. Susan Park gave a speech about community preservation, a city council member talked about inclusive development, and then they asked me to speak. I stood at a makeshift podium, looking out at faces that represented 3 generations of my family, and dozens of families who'd built this neighborhood. My parents came to America with nothing. I began. They built something anyway. Not because it was easy, but because they believed in the possibility of creating security for their children. This building represents that belief. I paused, finding Jason in the crowd. He was standing with Emma and Lucas, his hands on their shoulders, his expression unreadable. Last year my son sold this building. He betrayed that legacy for reasons that made sense to him at the time, but that devastated me and our family. I was angry. I'm still angry sometimes, but anger isn't a strategy. It's not a solution. I looked around the renovated space, at volunteers who'd given countless hours, at organizations that had invested resources, at a community that had rallied to preserve something precious. This building stands today, not because one person saved it, but because many people decided it was worth saving. That's the real lesson here. Legacy isn't what one generation builds, and the next inherits. Legacy is what communities fight to preserve, generation after generation, even when it would be easier to let it go. The applause was generous, warm. People approached me afterward to share their own stories, to thank me, to express hope that more of the neighborhood's history could be preserved. Jason waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching me. He had Emma's hand in his left, Lucas's in his right, the 3 of them a unit that Michelle had begun, allowing more frequently as Jason proved himself reliable in small, consistent ways. "That was a good speech, Mom," he said quietly. "Generous, given everything. It was honest," I replied, "which is all I've tried to be through this whole mess." Emma tugged at my sleeve. "Grandma, can we make dumplings here?" "In the community kitchen?" "Absolutely," I said, kneeling to her level. "That's exactly what the space is for. Making food, sharing culture, keeping traditions alive, and learning from mistakes," Jason added softly. "That's part of tradition too, isn't it? Each generation learning from the last one's errors." "If they're willing to learn," I agreed. "If they're willing to do the hard work of making amends." "I am," Jason said. "It's taken me a year to really understand that, but I am willing, however long it takes." I stood up, meeting my son's eyes. The anger had faded over these months, replaced by something more complicated. Not forgiveness exactly, because some betrayals were too deep for simple absolution, but maybe acceptance. Maybe hope that he was genuinely changing, slowly becoming someone who understood what he'd almost destroyed. "However long it takes," I echoed. "That's the commitment." As evening fell, and people began leaving, I stood alone in the empty building, running my hands along walls my father had painted, walking through spaces my mother had filled with steam, and laughter and the smell of baking bread. The building was saved, but it would never be exactly what it had been. That past was gone, irretrievable, but maybe that was okay. Maybe legacy wasn't about preservation in amber, but about adaptation, about taking what previous generations built, and finding new ways to honor it, new purposes that served the same fundamental values. My phone buzzed with a text from Jason. "Thank you for today, for everything."